I am Rob Zdybel, or at least I purport to be. And I was hired in by Owen Rubin to work at Atari in April of 1979. And I had my best ever work experience there for about 3 years, and still a pretty good work experience a couple years later. And I was there when the Trammels took the company over in '84, and I worked for them, and I enjoyed working for the Trammels very much, thank you. And I stayed with the Trammels until they closed the company in 1995. So if you've got questions about what happened at Atari, pretty much I was there.
Titles?
Titles? Titles I shipped? In all those years? God, I didn't ship any titles. A lot of titles. 2600 Pigs in Space, I was the lead on that team with Aspromonte and, who was the other guy? I can't remember. Real Sports Football. I didn't really like any of these games. I didn't really sign on to be a 2600 programmer, you've got to understand. I signed on because I was going to get a free Atari 800 computer. And my alternative to that, and I already had my TTL data cookbook out and was working with it, thank you very much, I'm an electrical engineer. So I was going to build my own homebrew. But once I went into Atari Labs and I saw an 800 with the Colleen chipset in there, I said, F that shit. I can make a really good machine. I can have a really good machine just for joining the company, and they want me to make games, and that rocks. So I made 2600 games because that was the slot they had open. I was originally interviewed by Owen Rubin in the coin-op branch, but they didn't have an opening for me, and upstairs said, sure, we'll take you. So that's how I ended up doing 2600 titles. So the first 2600 title I did, back in the day when you could do whatever you wanted,
Right.
was Stellar Track, is what they sold it as. Yes. It was Star Trek, okay?
You know? Exposure to the computer version of that?
Yes, totally. It was
Basically ported to 2600.
sort of, yeah, but it turned out to be a hell of a technical challenge. I don't know how many of you know what's inside of 2600 or care, but inside there for random number generation is what's called a Taylor counter, okay, which is basically a random number generator that counts up to the number of bits that it has. It just doesn't count sequentially. But whatever the count it does the same count over and over and over again. Now there was an 8-bit Taylor counter, which is a fairly small sequence, as you can see, only 128 elements. And, because never mind.
Use the sign.
Yeah, the sign bit was lost to you. Never mind why. Anyway, the problem is when I did Star Trek, I found that my random playfield generator was generating exactly 3 unique playfields. No matter what I seeded the frickin' Taylor counter with, I would get one of these 3 because the damn thing was just so sequential. It would lock up to itself and start giving me the same data over and over again. So that's when I got a big fetish about random number generation, which I still carry on today. Don't get me started about the random number generator was distributed with Basic C. RND. Whatever you do, if you do game design, do not use RND, okay? Stop yourself immediately. That was my first cart, and that was my first disappointment too, because at the time, you did whatever you wanted, and they would pretty much market it. And so I thought they're going to put my game out there, it'd be Star Trek, it'll be cool, I'll have a game called Star Trek, you know? Atari, hello? Could they got the license? Hello? You know? But that was our marketing at the time. We went through 2 eras of marketing. One where they just didn't give a shit. You make a game, they left you alone, and it was really sweet. And another where they were constantly interfering and driving the company into bankruptcy. And that was not so much fun.
Rock fight.
I told them about Rock Fight today. Okay, so there were 2 eras at Atari, one before marketing took over and one after. As Howard Warshaw always told me, marketing is a sign of a mature industry. So that's just good that they're taking over. And it's very mature now. The marketing team was small and funny at the time, and they didn't bother us. And so their only input to us was a memo that was posted in one corner of the engineering note board that said, marketing has these great ideas for games, please consider them. And number 1 on the list, every time they reissued the list, number 1 on the list was always Rock Fight. And I don't know about you, but I don't think I ever read the rest. I got to Rock Fight, like, okay,
I don't remember the list at all. I must have paid a lot of attention.
Yeah, so, and then later they came down and said stuff like to me, I did Real Sports Football, because I was told, oh, let me tell the Real Sports Football story.
Did you do Red versus Blue?
Red versus Blue? No, that's not for me.
Supposed to be the prototype that showed that you could put the appropriate number of sprites on it.
Oh my God. Dear Jesus, save me. Okay.
The problem is out there.
Okay, let me tell the story, please, please. Don't tell the story, let me tell it.
Cleaning woman?
Okay, so we had a very nice managerette named Jewel Salvadell. So this is after the revolution, after we overthrew our management. We had no management, then they put management in. We said, get them out of here or we quit. They got rid of them. They put in a den mother named Jewel. Okay, Jewel was a sweetie, and she didn't bother you, and that was great. So Jewel came to me, and she said, we want to do a football game because people don't like your flying frogs. That was the house name for the existing football game, if you've never. And if you own the game, you can see why it was called Flying Frogs. Okay, so we need a replacement for Flying Frogs, and I'm like, you know, I'm not that excited about doing the project. Oh, please, please, Robbie, please. You know, because at that point, that's how marketing worked. Later, they came down and said, you will do this. You know, that's the world I work in now. But, yeah, at the time, it was please, please. And I said, look, Joel, it can't really be done, and I'll show you why. So I cooked up a little bit of code that showed 11 players versus 11 players standing on a blank play field.
So that was you.
Thank you. And I wrote that to show Jewel that the code could not be done. I put it in front of Jewel and I said, there you go. There's 22 players on a field. I said, but there's nothing left of the processor. If you want those players to move, I can't do it. If you want a ball to appear, it can't happen. If you want hash marks on the field, we could do something with, 8-bit wide play field. What do you think? I did this to demonstrate to you, Jewel, that this product cannot be done like this. Now, what I'm proposing is we do a cut-down version of football with only I got a tag team football, like 5 players on a team or something, something like that. I can do that for you. I can do a good job of that. No. That's what we ended up doing, right? Anyway, so that's not good. So I brought this to her. I said, look, here's the proof that it can't be done. 6 weeks later, I get a marketing VP in my office. He's telling me I should do this game. I said, no, really, it can't be done. He says, oh, yeah, I got a cartridge right here. It proves that it can be done. So, ask me someday about trying to kill the Colleen chipset.
Why?
Why? I don't know technical stuff. How many people are really interested in technical details of how this shit is done? Oh, okay, fine. Okay, so you all are probably familiar with the Atari 400-800 chipset. Okay, there was another chipset after the 400-800 chipset. It was actually a Doug Neubauer design. Okay, and Neubauer was a pretty good designer. What was it called, Colleen? What the fuck was that?
Was that
called?
Super Stella?
It was called Super Stella at one point, but that wasn't the house name. Anyway, it was a new chipset to replace the Colleen chipset. It was supposed to be a new souped-up game machine design. And Doug Neubauer had done it. And Doug had written a little Pac-Man. It was like one of the last things Doug did for the company. And Doug had written a little Pac-Man game for it, which pretty much worked. All right? So I was one of the first engineers to get my hands on a prototype. And the 6502 has 2 interrupt vectors. One is called IRQ, and one is called NMI. IRQ stands for interrupt request, and NMI stands for non-maskable interrupt. In other words, you can ignore interrupt requests, but you cannot ignore an NMI. NMI is put on the chip for things like forcing a restart in case the machine gets fucked up. And here's something you can't ignore. Wake up, son of a bitch. So, unfortunately, IRQs on the 6502 nest, but NMIs do not. So what happened was Doug had hooked each sprite would run out of a little buffer and draw the sprite on the screen. At the end of the sprite run, it would trigger an NMI to tell you, hey, the sprite's done, you can reload it and reuse it or whatever you want to do with it. Okay? Now, it turned out there were 4 sprites in the machine. So if all you wanted to do is Pac-Man with just 4 sprites on the display, you were okay. Because when the interrupt came, you could safely ignore it. However, if you had multiple sprites on the screen or wanted to reuse a sprite, the problem was they would get an NMI. And the problem was if 2 reusable sprites happened to cross a line boundary, to line up together accidentally, which occasionally happens in a video game once or twice, those 2 would both issue an NMI at the same time. And the processor couldn't tell you that couldn't tell you one, that there'd actually been more than one NMI, because it could only register one. And it couldn't tell you which pair it actually collided, right? It would just give you one of them. So you could have up to 3 sprite redraws issued in a quick interval, and you would get one NMI and one sprite redraw. Consequently, the other 2 sprites would go unserviced. They would leave garbage down the display, or a new sprite would not appear where it should, okay? As long as you didn't have more than 4 sprites, the game worked fine, okay? So now all you people have probably grasped now that this unit is unusable, because if I can't service my sprites, I can't have more than 4 sprites, it's not going to be a competitive product, okay? It took me about 3 to 4 times as long to explain this to marketing vice presidents, because of course they don't understand the concept of interrupt or programming or how to find your head with both hands and a flashlight. The worst part of it was, I would no sooner explain all this to one group of marketing people than they would leave the company, and a new group of hotshots would come in and say, what about this hardware here? We've got this hardware, why aren't we using it? And I'd say, well, it can't be done. And they say, oh, no, look, this Pac-Man game works just fine. And we'd be back to square one. And I cannot tell you how many times I had to kill that chipset. It was a lot of fun being an engineer.
That was one of my last contributions before I left Atari, because I was working on that chipset when it was a wire-wrapped S100, you know, a stack about this.
It never went anywhere else.
It shouldn't have. And of course, when it didn't work, everybody would just hit their elbow against it and it would start working again. But I was trying to do a baseball. They said, well, we want some test code here. So I said, well, how about baseball? It's got plenty of players. And I came upon the problem Rob, and I wrote a memo that said, gee, I'm sorry, guys, it's really a nice chipset, but we're going to be up the creek if we try to use too many sprites on this machine. So
It had another
then I
weakness.
bailed.
It had another weakness, which I'll describe, because the first game I tried to do for this chipset was Neubauer's own Star Raiders game, all right? And it turned out, although you had 4 sprites, they were ganged in 2 pairs, okay? Logically, in the hardware, they looked like 2 pairs of sprites. And that's how the hardware felt about them and drew them, to the point where one of them was the master sprite and one was the slave sprite of each pair, such that if the slave sprite tried to be bigger than the master sprite was over any set of lines, the slave sprite would be compressed to the height of the master sprite. Yeah, so you get these 2 ships, and one would come close to you, and suddenly it would all be clipped down, you know, and just clipping the shit out. I said, well, how come my ship is suddenly only showing 8 lines? It should be showing 16. What's wrong? I'm sure Doug would have worked the bugs out if he'd been around. But the people running the shop by then were nuts. So talk about Bob for a while. Bob's a big shot. I'm a nothing.
So that was about 81?
About 81 or so.
Yeah. Let's see, I'm Bob Smith. I started writing calculator games, wrote a first-person road race game on the, actually it was a processor technology Soul that I ported to the TRS-80 and sold it to Creative Computing, which is long by the boards. So I was living in New Mexico at the time, and my wife said, get me the hell out of here, because she was born in San Jose, so she wanted to be back in the Bay Area. So I went back and went to Atari and interviewed with CoinOp and Consumer, and they both made me an offer, but frankly, the CoinOp guys scared me. They were way too competent as far as I was concerned, and they were. They were really quite good, and I really liked Dennis Koval, who was running the 2600 group at the time, so I signed on with Consumer. And that was beginning of 1980, and the first card I did was video pinball for Atari after I had puzzled out the TIA manual for a few weeks.
Wait, I don't want to interrupt you, but I do want to stop you. That was not Bob's first effort. Bob's first 2600 game that he wanted to make was sailing.
Well, sailing. I'm a sailor. I took my 20s off and built sailboats.
You guys were this close to having pirates on the 2600 in 1980, man.
Oh, well.
You just have the code?
No, I never started it.
Oh.
I pitched the idea and everybody, what the hell are you thinking? So, nope, didn't happen. And actually, I carried on the idea for a long time, and then I saw Sid Meier's effort, which I thought was first rate, and said, no, it's been done. He's done a good job of it, and there's no need for me to do it. So that was in later years. I've been through most of the companies, you know, Electronic Arts and Accolade and 3DO, and yeah, I've been around the block a few times. I've actually been doing games continuously since 1980, 79. I think I sold my first game in 79, so I never really left the business. And I'm still doing it. I still enjoy doing it much more than I do managing. I know yesterday, if you were at Dave and Gary's and my panel yesterday, it was mainly concerned with legal issues. I stay as far away from possible from that. So anyway, I did video pinball, and then about that time, I was 30 years old and had gray hair, so they said, oh, you should be a manager, you really shouldn't be coding. So I said, okay, and they doubled my salary. I think I got the highest pay raises Atari had seen. You know, they were paying me $16,500 when I hired on. So that was great. And then in 1981, Dennis Coble and Rob Fulop and I left and did Magic. And it was mainly because there were no royalties, no credit, which, you know, credit I don't care about. I mean, Bob Smith, you know, I've never really thought I could realistically get any fame with a name like that. So the money worked for me. And it was a chance to get out of Atari and do a startup. And, you know, yeah, I had 2 kids at home and so on, but you know, you're only young once, and if you're going to take a risk, you may as well take it at that time. So we split off and did a Magic, and for a Magic I did Star Voyager and Dragonfire and Riddle of the Sphinx and Moonquake, and did a port for Parker Brothers of Star Wars: The Arcade Machine. So that's most of my 2600 work, and I won't bother you with work past that. You know, I did get to meet Charles Barkley when I was working at Accolade. I did a couple of Charles Barkley products, so I've done some sports. I don't do a lot of senseless slaughter games anymore, but they never really were my favorites. So that's who I am.
So I want to ask a question. You and I were talking a little while ago about like some of the things you did, like in Dragonfire, using the ball as the eye for the dragon. So in any of the games you did, is there a particular technical exploit you did, or that you figured out that you're particularly proud of?
Well, actually, I got a mention in IEEE Spectrum for my Dragonfire kernel. They had a little article on 2600, and Dave Crane wouldn't let his name be used for Dragster because he was using a moving 6-char, and I had only used 4 characters for the dragon, so I had a moving 4-char, which hadn't been done before. And technically, Riddle was one of my better kernels, I think, just because it was, you know, if you look at Riddle of the Sphinx and you look at River Raid, the kernels have to be very, very close because we were doing exactly the same tricks all the way. But obviously, Carol Shaw had a better feel for a game than I did. I wanted a puzzle Egypt game, so that's what I did. So it became kind of a cult success, but didn't really get the success that River Raid did, not by a long shot. How about you, Rob?
What, technical innovations?
Or anything you've done that you're particularly proud of?
Oh, I've done a bunch of work. My favorite game that I've done, generally when you do a game, you hate it. By the time you're done with the little monster, you're pretty sick of it. Well, you know it inside and out, don't you? And you play it all the time. You're pretty sick of it. So generally the rule of thumb is with games, you're pretty tired of them. And you can tell when you've got a really good game when your team is playing the game. And in modern development, we have teams that are larger. Back then it was just one guy shows. You can tell you got a good game when the team wants to play the game. And I've done one game that I enjoyed playing long after I had minted it. I designed it with my game club in mind. A bunch of old friends have been gaming, met at Atari
Ever
in
since I've known you.
Yeah, we're still getting together. And, you know, I wanted to make a game for them, and that was Warbirds, and I'm really pleased with how that game turned out. In fact, my boasting point is, you know, Warbirds is in the Smithsonian, Dave.
That was Lynx, right?
Yeah, it's Lynx. And so the Smithsonian collection is a permanent collection. It doesn't go anywhere, so archaeologists will find me long after I've rotted away. Well, you guys got questions? Why don't we throw the floor open to questions? We'll talk about anything you want. I was going to say, I said to Bob on the way up here, you know what we should do is like throw out the name of a designer and we will dish dirt on this person. Todd Fry's a great guy.
I know, Todd is one of my favorite people.
Todd was my office mate for years and years. What would you like to know about Todd?
Well, was it his idea to make it a 2-player Pac-Man, and therefore that's why it looks so good?
Actually,
No.
I was a supervisor at that point, and I will take some of the blame.
And I was his roommate.
I really, yeah,
I
the
will
two
not,
of them share
I
an
cannot
office.
tell you how many times Todd Fry, now, I was actually the first person approached to do Pac-Man, as you know, maybe being Mr. Supervisor. I don't know. I didn't consider him my supervisor at the time. He was a junior to me in programming skill, experience, and talent.
Absolutely, I learned so much from everybody else.
I thought it died with the gray hair thing. You were actually our supervisor? I didn't know that. Fucking A. Anyway, they came to me and said, you want to do Pac-Man? I said, no. You can't do Pac-Man in 4K because the ghosts are going to flicker. You can't make a kernel in that small a space. It's going to hold non-flickering ghosts. They went to Todd, who was kind of the low man on the totem pole. Todd was my office mate basically the entire time he and I were at Atari. So I know Todd fairly well. And they said, will you do this? And Todd, being a low guy on the totem pole, said, well, yeah, I'll give it a shot. And he was a brilliant programmer. Do not underestimate Todd Fry. He was one of the most brilliant 2600 programmers to walk around.
Absolutely.
And that especially eclipsed a gentleman with initials of DC. Todd was untouchably brilliant. He was a high school dropout, but a natural genius. And he begged them repeatedly in my presence to please give me 8K to do this game in. Please. I can't do a game without flicker in 4K. And he was right, it couldn't be done. So ultimately, they would not do that for him. They insisted that the game be done in 4K.
And then it's just because of money.
Huh?
It was just because of money.
I don't know. I think it's just because they were dickwads, personally.
There were a lot of 8K carts out when he was doing that, and of course,
the minute-
ROM was a little more expensive then, and they had to put a little more bank switch.
The minute this game was handed off to Ray Kazar's pet company, which he owned 80% of, and they produced Ms. Pac-Man, they were given 8K from the get-go. And there was never any question about whether they would get 8K.
Jody
So-
Sturgis yesterday was talking about buying effective 16K chips so that you get 8K out of it.
Well, that was the old days.
Oh, okay.
That's still true. When I went to school, I was taught to work from the TTL data book. And the prof said, okay, here's your TTL data book. I know it's required reading in this class. And everything in it is a lie. Okay? All these charts that show response curves for transistors and capacitors and shit, it's all bullshit. This is the best goddamn part they could get out of the batch. Remember that when you're building, because they won't come up to these standards. That may not be true anymore, but I kind of doubt it. I bet it still is. Engineering and hardware is usually done with very good tolerance, and I like hardware engineering. It's fun. That's what I loved about working on 2600, was working on the naked iron. It was really, really so much more fun. Bob still programs more than I do. I don't consider myself a particularly good programmer anymore, and because I don't particularly like working with other people's code. I don't mind a compiler, I don't mind an assembler, but when I have to use your library package and it doesn't make any goddamn sense, I'm not too pleased. When I put commands into your library package and it doesn't work the way I want it to, or it takes fucking 5 hours to draw 3 sprites, what the hell is wrong with the internals of this code? You know what I say? I say, this is what we get for letting children write code. But what I'll do is, I love you guys, don't get me wrong. What I'll do is, I really loved working on the naked iron and optimizing code in hardware. And when you deal with hardware directly, software engineers can build whatever kind of weird castles in the sky they like, right? You can make your software look like anything, and they frequently do, and it frequently gets pretty ugly. Hardware engineers are much more constrained in what they can do. They have interference problems with radio frequency. They have problems actually making chips work. Everything is bound by physics and bound to the ground so much more that hardware is much more easy and predictable and natural and feels correct so much more than working with software. So working with hardware is a breeze, and it's kind of a real trip. And I'm sorry that a lot of you guys will not ever get the experience of actually running on naked iron. It's really fun.
No, I love the 2600 precisely because of that.
And it also shows you we talked about 2600 was, maybe not, I've got so many conversations, I'm losing my mind. The 2600 was originally designed by a handful of engineers, Joe might have told you this yesterday, to just do combat. That was the only game they thought they could get out of it, maybe a couple of others. It was kind of basically a combat engine. And when people started doing Space Invaders, that was the moving six
Rick
character
Maurer,
program.
that was a brilliant piece of work.
I mean, no one expected anything like that was even possible. Night Driver, no, never in the cards. And it just goes on and on. Solaris, one incredible software programming feat after another. And why? Because you give people a series of simple tools, and you challenge them to put them together in interesting ways. Please.
Have either of you got a chance to peruse the Atari Age booth? What do you think of the latest developments of the 2600?
I did this morning. I'm very impressed.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, apart from having a few extra goodies in the cartridge, which would have, we would have killed for, some interesting new style kernels, and, you know, lots more characters on the screen. You know, of course, they're in playfield resolution, but still, I think they've done a tremendous job.
The 4K Pac-Man.
4K Pac-Man, yeah.
I mean, what would Todd think of that? It would have been exactly what he would have done if they'd given him the opportunity, but they did it, a hobbyist did it in 4K.
It's over at the booth, check it out.
Oh, I have to see it. I don't,
You should. You definitely should.
someone finally figured out how to do,
Two-player mode.
oh, okay, there you go. Take it
We were
back.
talking about that, so you can go back and talk about
No,
the
it's
player modes and one
But that's the point. That's why this Pac-Man was better, because it was strictly one player.
Well, actually, they had twice as much memory too.
Oh, this Pac-Man was 8K?
Yes,
Okay.
from day one. And they never had to argue for it, because it turned out later Ray owned 80% of that company, was raking money off it. I think there's a conflict of interest there or something, but I don't know.
No.
There's so much cocaine involved in that department. No, literally, please.
Yeah, well, since you're saying, you can ask about Dirk, what was Carol like, you know?
Carol Shaw?
Yeah.
Wow, working with Carol Shaw is like, she's one of the best programmers I've ever worked with.
I second that, absolutely.
What a genius. Do you realize that she wrote an alpha beta pruning algorithm for frickin' checkers that fit in 128 bytes of RAM? Would you like to do that someday? My hat is off. I still don't know how she did that. Working with Carol was, I shared an office with Carol briefly. It was pretty funny. They moved Todd and I into Carol's office, do you remember? We had this little corner
It
office.
seems like a little bit of a mismatch.
Isn't it a mismatch? Carol and I actually went back, Carol and I went camping together. I met her husband Ralph, and you guys know the legend of early Atari. It was just the greatest place to work. You'd come in on Saturday, you'd come in on Sunday, you couldn't find a place to park your damn car, okay? Because everyone was there, because it was a rockin' party. And that meant, of course, a certain amount of drug abuse. The cocaine was across the street in the marketing department. Mostly we had what we called marijuana review boards. Yeah, you would actually announce it over the intercom. MRB? Yeah. So, and
Up to the roof.
yeah, well, it was not just the roof, it was the ladies' room. And later it got even worse, people just sparking up in their offices, okay? So, you know, Todd and I were among the worst offenders, clearly. And Carol was a sweetheart. She was really sweet, but completely straight. I mean, I don't think Carol even drank, you know? I mean, if I had a brain like Carol's, I don't think I would fuck with it either. You know? I'd be so happy to have that piece of machinery. But, so they moved me and Todd into that office with Carol. So I shared an office with Carol for a while I was doing 800 Missile Command. And I don't think it was a real good match for her, though. I think she found it a bit of a disruptive environment.
It was.
Well, actually, after Carol moved out, it was Todd and I's office. And the person next door to us was Carl Nielsen. Remember Carl?
Yes.
Carl was our a Dane and very put together and head of our development, hardware development at the time. Doug Neubauer would have reported to Carl. And he would frequently have vendors and other people from the outside, the real world, you know, in his office doing real business. And meanwhile, over in the other office, me and Todd have got our office hotboxed, you know, and the smoke is pouring through the ventilation into Carl's office. And you hear this timid little on the door, and you open it, and there's Carl, always so polite. He's, would you mind maybe going outdoors? I have a very important client in here. I got to tell another story on Carl because he's so great. We were at the big conference in Monterey at the DoubleTree, and it happened that the layout of the building was such that there was an upper balcony, and then below the upper balcony was seating for people. So if you came out of the conference hall and you walked to the balcony, you were basically looking down on people that are at bench seating, you know, 5-10 feet below you from the balcony rail. And seated below on the bench seating was a woman who was very well endowed. And quite a low decollete. And you look over the rail, you go, whoa. And you're looking at this, and Carl walks up, mild. You got to know how mild this guy is. He's like Danish and totally put together and completely reserved. And he walks up and he sees where I'm looking. He says, oh, he said, that would make a baby cry.
I didn't, who did the six care? Was that Carol?
Sixth character was Rich Maurer. The
Okay.
moving six character Colonel, he
Well,
did
not
that
moving,
for.
just a static
It
six
was moving. He did that for Space
Space
Invaders.
Invaders.
It moved left and right.
Okay, so the six care was done for Space Invaders.
Yeah, and that was Rick's work.
Yeah. Yeah, Rick was another great one.
Rick was a genius.
Yep.
What's Carol up to now?
I don't know.
Well, I thought she was doing security, but I haven't heard anything of her in.
You see more about her husband,
decades.
Ralph Merkel. He's quite famous. If you Google Ralph, you'll find he's really big in the mathematics and CI. And yeah. But he's a weird hiking companion. Don't go hiking with him.
So going back to the smoking in the office and the stuff coming over to cube walls, I remember in a.
It wasn't a cube. We had hard-walled
in an
offices.
Office wall, sorry. In the, one of the other conferences a couple of years ago, I remember it was, one of the Activision guys said, oh, no, that stuff didn't happen. So was there a group of the sort of the straight guys?
No, there's liars.
It was the Activision guys, if there were straight guys.
There were straights and there were stoners, and there was a huge party every Friday at 3 o'clock.
Right.
And what I used to tell my practicing new engineers is, in the day, we had this giant party at 3 o'clock, and that's we go, 3 o'clock party. And about 80% of the time, I just stayed at my desk, because what we were doing was so much more fun than just go grabbing a drink and hanging out.
Right. So
But-
is this over at Gibraltar?
This was
No.
in Gibraltar? No, this
No.
was, yeah, it was
This was on
Caribbean.
Borregas.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Caribbean Borregas, yeah, okay. It was the main building, the one that had the empty field across, where the building where we started.
Right.
The one that they took a picture of the engineers and the empty lot across the street, and they sent it out. It was a advertising pic. It showed all the guys standing in the field, and it said, Atari engineers, outstanding in their field. They used to like us. They loved us at one time. Come, more questions, please.
When and why did it change?
Why did it
Sounds like
change?
later on, the engineers, people were leaving for other companies.
Well, to start with, there was the Fantastic Four, of course, and they went to Ray and said, line our pockets. We don't care about the rest of the engineering staff, which is pretty much typical for certain individuals in that group. And, they left the company. And then people started saying, well, we want to be treated like talent because we see that we're talent. And there was more and more complaints, and there was the full-up turkey incident, and the business grew up. Basically, I was telling somebody, it was like the record industry in the 60s. In the 60s, the producers had no idea what was going to sell. You go to the janitor in the men's room, and he's more plugged into what's happening in the San Francisco scene than you are. So the next thing you know, he's a vice president, and he's promoting some band called Jefferson Airplane and Grateful Dead. Who's ever heard of these people? But their records are selling, right? And so the producers of the record business basically went hands-off in the 60s, and now you see that they're more hands-on, and you can see the result. Right? And it was the same with us. They had no idea what we were doing in that building. They just knew it was a gold mine. It kept producing these cartridges. And they would sell them for, and the cost of production was nothing. Nothing. An engineer would make a cartridge, okay? One engineer would take 6 months roughly to make a cartridge. That engineer is getting paid $30,000 a year. I know I was, and I was perfectly happy to take it. You've got to figure your total production cost for a 6-month cartridge with a $30,000 engineer is about $30K. And you can turn around and sell this cart for how many million? And it's all gravy. You don't care where this stuff is coming from. It wasn't until the Activision guys left and the industry was suddenly, the TIA secrets were spilled everywhere. I remember going to the CES that year and seeing all the people who were using the TIA wrong. We go from booth to booth, and, oh, they don't know about HDEL. Oh, he doesn't know how to use the invert bit. That's interesting. Yeah, but basically the stolen manuals got out everywhere.
So it wasn't straight reverse engineering, they weren't working from scratch.
Listen, the courts said it was.
Yeah, I think after they sued us, I don't think they did a lot more lawsuits. But we had an actual
And
chip
Magic
dealer
actually did
the
reverse
TIA
engineer.
for us, but Games by Apollo and some of the other people, I really don't know how that worked out legally.
But it's all kabuki. It's all kabuki. If you know the 2600 programmers, and I sadly was one of them, can tell you from the machine code what the opcode is, or from the opcode what the machine code will be. For example,
EA is no op.
Thank you. I was going to use that very example. Yeah.
That's such a great one.
And I think an A9 is a subroutine call.
Yep.
So, I mean, these kind of things stick with you. And the register set in a TIA is only, 30, 40 registers. I mean, after you've used it for a while, you know every register by heart and every bit by heart. You could practically write the manual from memory, which I don't believe they did. I think they actually took manuals. But what the fuck? It's kind of a kabuki anyway. How do you keep this information quiet? And the way it should have been kept quiet is Ray Kassar, now he may not have known anything about engineering. He clearly didn't. He may not have known anything about electronics. He clearly didn't. He may not have known anything about games. He clearly didn't. Okay? But he was supposed to be put in place by Warner because he was a brilliant businessman. He should have realized Warner is making a fortune off Atari, and no one knows it because all of Atari's books are hidden inside of Warner. We were actually the backbone of Warner for several years. And he should have realized that once the cat gets out of the bag, that there's $1 billion a year to be made, for a $30,000 investment of each cart, that's not a secret you want to let out. And he easily could have kept Activision from forming just by going to those gigs and giving them what's called chump change in the business. If he'd say, you're right, I'm going to give you each $100,000 now, and if you stick around for another 6 months, I'll give you another $100K then. That would have cost him $400K. And it was nothing. He could easily have done that. But he wasn't bright enough to see that was what was going on around him, and that's just a fact.
And all that leakage, and all those new companies that formed and smothered the marketplace and led to the collapse.
I mean, the management at Atari was awful. The only good thing about it is they left us alone. They basically ran the company into the toilet. They took the Atari 400-800 chipset, which was intended to be a new video game after the 2600. And instead of running with it with a new video game chipset in 1979, they considered to sell the 2600 into what, 1983, 84, when the Tremels finally finished flushing the rest of the inventory down the toilet. It was like 85. So,
It's a small business machine.
yeah, they just weren't forward-looking. They didn't understand what they were doing.
And still do games at 87, 88. And then the PAL marketplace.
Excuse me, what you're saying?
PAL, the European.
We did PAL.
Oh,
We
yeah.
did PAL. That was one of the main hassles of converting a 2600 game. You had to do a PAL version. Not only that, but there's not just one PAL standard, friends. In case you think PAL is like NTSC and there's one of them. No, there's not. There's PAL UK, there's PAL Brazil, there's PAL China, there's PAL India, there's PAL Calcutta. You can forget it. And each one of these has a slightly different tweak. But the problem was the color on PAL. You had to adjust the PAL color because you didn't get the same palette as you did on NTSC.
And it was 50 hertz, so.
Yeah, that was the
it
other
screwed up
problem.
all your motions, so you had to account for all that.
Yeah, you
And
quickly learned
The
to.
screen height was taller.
Yes, everything was effed up in PAL, but we always did a PAL conversion. It was one of the, even from the earliest cartridge I ever did,
Yeah.
the last things you did was do a PAL conversion. And we had a special PAL monitor with a PAL NTSC plugged into it so we could see it.
About how long did that take to get that conversion?
It was not a hard deal,
A week?
Yeah, a couple
Because you
days.
needed to check it, and you needed to check the timing, because if your timing was off in PAL, you lost color.
Hopefully,
So-
you'd written your game with the free running timer instead of locked to the frame rate, because if you locked to the frame rate, now you were fucked. But other than that, it wasn't that hard.
Once that was done, it couldn't be converted?
Hmm?
You're saying it couldn't be converted? once-
No, it was just annoying, because if you locked to the frame rate, previously, every action was taking place at a 60 hertz rate. Now it's taking place at a 50 hertz rate, so everything's slowed down consequentially. If your game can tolerate a 20% drop in speed, then you're okay. If you're sloppy and you're not really thinking carefully about how to design the game, you wrote it locked to the frame rate. But very few 2600 games were actually, the logic was not locked to the frame rate typically. It was locked to a timer. And that largely because of the PAL conversion that needed to be done.
Well, now we have hobbyists that do all those conversions for us. Virtually every PAL game has been converted to NTS and vice versa. And they're posted on Atari.
There you go. Who's got a question about the old days? Too boring? Yeah. Howard Scott Warshaw.
Howard
what a
almost
great guy.
joined us here today, but
Howard's a psychologist these days.
he is.
And happily married for the third time, finally.
Right?
Yes, he
right.
did, and they're quite excellent. If you can find one, you can find both Bob and I talking about the business again. Howard, how many people here know about the unrestrained creativity memo? about 19, after you left.
This has to be after I left.
Oh, yeah, it's well after this, because we were in the other building. And Howard was working on E.T., I believe, at the time. And Mike Moon, remember Mike Moon?
Yes, I remember.
Pretty
Mike.
boy, real pretty boy. And the
Good hair.
company, good hair, and they had, I had 8.5, 11 glossies of Mike Moon for publicity purposes. Don't ask me why. He'd been a football player. He was a handsome devil. And he sent out an email that confused the shit out of us in 2600 about the danger of unrestrained creativity in the game design department. And he felt it was okay that we were making games, but that, somehow all this creativity needed to be channeled more appropriately by someone by himself, perhaps. He lasted about 6 months after that memo, and then in some internal executive fight was outed. And so Howard, on his wall, forever after, had one of these 8.5 by 11 glossies of Mike Moon, prepared apparently to go to the barbershop. Joe Decuir, come up here.
Want me up there?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
And underneath it, he had handwritten, "Take a little off the top, but leave the head." That's Warsaw humor.
So were you at Atari when Joe was still there?
I was. I had the great pleasure of working with Joe Decuir.
Oh,
Sit.
yes.
Please, Joe.
I was so lucky to
Tell
have
people who
guys
you
like
are.
him there.
Joe Decuir was Mr. Stella. If you like your 2600, you look at the man who made it.
I'll repeat what I said yesterday. I'm a contributor to Stella. The first day I worked at Atari for Jay Miner, he said, "Success has 1,000 fathers, failure is an orphan." And so there's a huge collection of people who all contribute. I was, however, very lucky. You can be as prepared as you want, but luck still matters. And I lucked into working at Atari in the end of 1995. For example, I was lucky in a different way. In the summer of 1975, I'm at Disneyland with my youngest brother. I'm 24, he's 12. And we're walking down the street, and we pass an arcade, and we go in the arcade, and there is an Atari tank game. I had never played any Atari anything before. So we played, lost a lot of quarters. He won. That fall, I lost my job in medical research, and I needed a new job. And a friend of mine referred me to people at Atari, and I was interviewed. Luckily, I had bought a 6502 of my very own in September of 1975, and a Kim development system to go with it, so I was training myself to be relevant. And I went to Atari then to interview, and I had two big things going in my favor. One was I already understood the 6502, and the other is they interviewed me by having me play Atari games, and I passed. So I got the job, and I got to go work for Jay Miner in, what is it? I'm just blanking. Los Gatos in September that year. And I chose that job because I'd already learned that when you're getting new jobs, if you have the choice, you choose the job that teaches you more than you already know. And the other job I was offered was going to suck me dry of what I already knew. And this one was going to teach me to design chips. Yes! So I got to work on this embedded system thing where my biggest contribution was that I understood hardware and software. And so in this development process with Jay, I debugged the original thing because I knew both. I knew if they said it's software or if it's hardware, I could figure out which it was and I could make things work. And then we redesigned it for production. And I got to move things into hardware, which are hard in software, like collision detection. Anybody ever write games and have to do collision detection in software? Right, you know what I'm talking about. A handful of RS flip-flops beats a whole lot of time spent in firmware. And on the other side, those of you who have done show of hands, who's done 2600 development before?
Come on, Bob, put your hand up.
Sorry.
What? Guys up here. Okay.
Okay.
There is no bitmap in the 2600. There's only a piece of hardware that accepts a line at a time. And as a result, we were designing in 10 micron features, right? You guys have all heard of 40 nanometer features and 22 nanometer features and whatnot. Imagine the difference between 22 nanometer and 10 micron. It's very 500 to 1. So we couldn't get a lot of gates on this part. And the way the 2600 worked was the horizontal logic was derived from the way they did coin-op games, like Pong. So there is a counter that keeps track of how many clocks are in a line, and there's another counter running in parallel, which represents where the moving object is. And to get things to move horizontally, you have to reset it at the right time and then start issuing little offsets with respect to where it is. Larry Wagner was great. He hired a whole bunch of great programmers. You heard about some of them yesterday. They looked at this hardware and they said, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that to us. That's really weird. So what I did is I created something called Compute Horizontal Reset, or CHRIST for short.
Christ, my ass, it was pronounced Christ.
Christ. As in, oh! Right? And I wrote this thing to abstract the hardware to the programmers. They could call this routine with a binary number. Here's where I want this object to appear, and my little tiny bit of firmware would put it in the right place and return. And this was enabling technology. I think that the product would have had a much shorter life in the market without things like Christ.
You're the man who wrote Christ, huh?
God help me, yes. And it was because I was bilingual. I understood that if we replaced all these slip counters, which were all polynomial, they were polynomial counters. They were very small because they were just using gate capacitance, right? They didn't even have, the classic flip-flop has at least 6 gates in it, and these had 3, okay? So replacing all these polynomial counters with a binary counter and a bunch of different comparators would have made the chip at least 50% larger. And at 1/4 of an inch on a side in 1975, that was as large as anybody could make anything in 1977, right? So that was a choice between, can we get it to work or can we not get it to work?
I'll tell you, as a new engineer, starting it, I've got a question. Ask the question, please.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
All
okay.
right. So as a new engineer, starting in 2600 land, you have never seen anything more inside out. If you've done games, you know that just running a game on a frame-by-frame basis is very, very different than writing linear end-to-end code, which is normally how you train and what most people are doing. On top of that, not only are you working on the frame-by-frame basis, but then you have to break each frame down into a line-by-line basis.
Right.
And you're going insane because the code is basically all inside out. It's not running
Right.
in a linear fashion. You're accomplishing a linear fashion by doing it in this incredible tight loop. And if it hadn't been for compute horizontal reset was an island of sanity, in the midst of
It was
madness.
middleware, what we now call a device
was.
driver, that
the
made
first
things
middleware.
tractable for the programmers. Here's the general structure of a 2600 game. There are no interrupts in the system. There is no resident OS. There is no BIOS. There's nothing in the system. So each programmer gets to own his own little universe. And again, there are no interrupts. So there is a timer, however, which is crucial. And there's a hook into the audio video chip called where you strobe a location and it will hold you to the beginning of the next horizontal blank. That's how time is owned. So the structure of the program will be in 2 pieces. There will be the code that runs in vertical blank. So at the bottom of the screen, okay, we now know we can go figure out what to happen next. So the processor gets out of running what we call the kernel. It starts polling the I/O addresses. It starts noticing where things are currently and whether anything has touched anything else or not. Remember horizontal reset? Remember collision detection in hardware. Figures out what's happening in the game and what changes need to be happening to objects in the game. It sets a timer when it starts that process. It pops out, waits for the timer so it knows it's the right time to then strobe vertical sync, which is just a bit. Waits 3 lines, strobes vertical sync again, turns it off, and sets the timer again to go do more thinking, usually what's going to happen next in the game and how it's going to structure what's left in the game. And when it's done with all that thinking, it's computed a whole bunch of index pointers, addresses, whatnot. It computes a lot of things so that the code that's running horizontally really fast doesn't have to think very hard to figure out what next to put into the horizontal only part. And then it runs
Horizontal
this.
line is 76 machine cycles long. A typical instruction in the 6502 takes 2 to 5 cycles. So
Right.
you end up having roughly 30 to 40 assembly instructions that you can issue on a line. You better think fast.
Literally think fast. Now, I must confess that the Video Olympics in combat, which I had a great deal to do with, were structured so that the kernel was 2 lines long. So I had time to do more thinking before I had to restart the kernel. And that's why all the vertical features in those games are at least 2 vertical lines tall. Anyway, all that stuff worked. Explaining how they worked will be reserved for another time. But anyway, panning back, I was prepared to write firmware and prepared to design hardware, so I was in the right place, the right time to make it possible to ship the product at all, let alone something that was wildly successful, okay? Again, we thought it was going to last maybe 3 years in the market, and so as soon as we finished Stella, we started working on the successor system, which was what I talked about yesterday. But by, the thing first shipped in 1977, the thing sort of died in the market about 1985, 1986. At that point in history, we had already sold 30 million units, which was astonishing. I'll tell you what's really astonishing now. I walk out on that floor, and then there's Atari Age, and there's a whole bunch of people who are still homebrewing new cartridges 36 years later. Ask yourself, those of you who are old enough, what kind of consumer products we were selling in 1977 and which of them are still around today. Analog TVs are all gone. Nobody's selling VHS tape recorders anymore. They've come and they've gone.
Don't forget dial rotary phones.
Those have long since gone. We're close to the point where there are more mobile phones in the United States than there are dial rotary phones, especially because it's illegal to make junk phone calls on them. So I'm just astonished that the product has been as successful as it is, and I consider one of my tasks going forward is to make sure that I'm helping the people who write new homebrew games for Atari Age and their friends and family and descendants can keep doing these things for a while. It was a great honor for me to luck into this job, and thank you.
Everyone worked at Atari, I think, feels the same way. It was really a lucky deal to have that great job. It was a great job. We're glad you enjoyed.
I think we're out of time.
We're glad you enjoyed
Okay.
the output. Apparently.